And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them. Yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
As always, welcome back to the podcast and welcome to 2020. It's been a few weeks since we've published because of the holidays, but it's good to be back, and hopefully you find some value in this year's podcasts and blog content and the work that we do with schools around the world. We always encourage and appreciate any shares and connecting with your networks to help us increase our audience, which helps us help more people. And a few things that I'd like to remind folks of are our upcoming events. First of all, March 16th through 18th, we'll hold our TeachThought PBL Hilton Head event, which is essentially our Foundations of PBL workshop. And that'll be 2.5 days in a really great, relaxing setting right on the beach in Hilton Head, South Carolina. That event is limited to 35 participants and is starting to fill up. So if you'd like to find more information on that, you can go to wegrowteachers.com/PBLHH. March 25th, we'll be back in Louisville with our TeachThought Leadership PBL workshop, which is a one-day workshop for school leaders to come up with and design a sustainable PBL implementation plan while learning the basics of PBL so they can support their teachers. And more information can be found on wegrowteachers.com/lead-PBL. And then, of course, our 4th annual TeachThought PBL Grow 20 event, which is June 22nd through 24th, again here in Louisville, Kentucky. wegrowteachers.com/grow20 is where you can find more information on that. If you just go to wegrowteachers.com, you'll see up on the top public events, and you can find it by navigating through any of those links. So again, welcome to 2020, and we're looking forward to a great year. In this podcast conversation, I spoke with Dan Buck, who is a teacher in Wisconsin, but also has published a few articles, one in particular that caught my attention and which we talked about in Areo magazine, called Critical Thinking is Nothing Without Knowledge. And as you might imagine, we talked a lot about that article and the topic of knowledge and critical thinking, which we had some disagreements on and certainly some overlap. We started our conversation talking about the role of teaching as a political act and advocacy, which was a little bit unexpected, certainly not directly related to the article. Then we got into the meat of the conversation and again talked a lot about how teaching might address knowledge gaps and the importance of knowledge, and as I call pull teaching and constructivist teaching versus a more teacher-centered role, and whether critical thinking is a skill or a habit or a mindset. And again, a really interesting conversation because Dan was a good sport in sort of standing in the line of fire as I peppered him with questions and challenged his thinking, and he challenged my thinking, which, as listeners to the podcast know, I think is a really important thing to engage in. So hopefully you find it useful to think more deeply about your craft. And without further ado, here's Dan Buck. Dan, welcome to the podcast. Happy to have you on, and we're going to talk about some things around critical thinking and education and teaching and knowledge. But before we do, I'd like to give you an opportunity, as I tend to like to do, to give our listeners some context of who they're listening to, because as we talked about before we went live here, neither of us is world famous. So tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and how you got to the point in the station in life in which you find yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate the chance to come on and talk about education. It's basically my favorite thing to do, and has derailed many family conversations. My brother's also an educator. So I'm a teacher in the Green Bay area of Wisconsin. I've been doing this. This is my 4th year. I teach English as a second language at the high school level. And I mean, that's my day job, from 7 until 4 o'clock during the day. I'm a teacher, and then in the afternoon and sometimes on my lunch break, I write for various publications. Quillet, Areo, Art Digital are some lesser known ones. The Washington Examiner, the Foundation for Economic Education, basically anyone who is willing to publish my stuff and isn't overly partisan and super crazy and gonna tarnish any kind of reputation. But I got into writing, kind of asked how did I get there. I think advocacy is an important part of being a teacher, and I have always been writing on the side, and just the more I teach, the more I read, the more I read, the more I think, the more opinions I have, and the more I think they're good for education. I think we all think we're right, and I just want to advance what I think is best for my students, what I think is best for public policy, what I think is best for public schools, and all that kind of stuff. And if I think it's going to help people, then I'm going to try and advance that cause.
Well, the part about finding not hyper-partisan or crazy partisan journalistic outlets is certainly a challenge these days. I'm not sure. I don't read Washington Examiner. I see some of their headlines and wonder about them, but same thing about Wall Street Journal and New York Times. And I just finished, I don't know if you have had a chance to read it or are aware of it, Matt Taibbi's book, Hate Inc., or Hate Incorporated, in which he really goes into depth and detail about the crisis of journalism and how it's really turned into entertainment and not so much about at least the goal or ideal of being objective. So that certainly is a challenge. And as we try to have discussions in and out of podcasts and other places, some of those places like Areo and Quillet are, I think, good resources for at least the attempt at heterodox kinds of conversations, and that's certainly a goal of this podcast. So one of the things that you mentioned, talk about advocacy as a teacher, and this isn't something that I had planned to discuss. I'm curious because that gets, at least tangentially, it brushes up against the idea of one of the questions that I've been somewhat wrestling with. I'm curious how you think about this as a teacher advocate or an advocate as a teacher, is the idea that teaching is a political act, which to me doesn't resonate very well with me. I think there's some real danger, depending upon how you might define that statement. But do you have any particular thought, or does it make sense that teaching is a political act in so far as you're trying to be an advocate as a teacher?
When I hear, the teaching is a political act, if you are in the education world, you've kind of heard that phrase, that buzzword. And it's not something I lean into in the classroom. It's not something I push for actively. But I think when I hear that, what I hear is you cannot teach and not advance some kind of a worldview. What are you choosing to read or not read? What is just naturally coming through in the words that you're saying to your students, how you're helping them process through the things in their life. Anything you do, you're going to be slowly, if I choose to read Shakespeare versus young adult fiction, if I choose to read a white author or a black author or a liberal or a conservative author, all of those choices are going to inculcate some kind of a worldview. And I think the best thing we can do isn't necessarily try and stay apolitical in the classroom, but try to make sure I'm including a diversity of voices, both ideologically and, diversity, like skin color diversity and station in life and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, certainly the idea that somebody can communicate and talk and think with students without expressing some political bias or coming from some political bias seems pretty unlikely. And I think the best teachers tend to be confusing insofar as that what they're teaching and how they're teaching is unclear. Their political bias is unclear. And I think I've mentioned it on the podcast before that I taught seniors in high school and taught government. So a natural question from them was, which way do I lean? Which way do I vote? Which I never would tell them, and actually enjoyed if they guessed wrong, which they did much of the time. And I took that as some sense of I'm doing something right. As I left that classroom and moved to Kentucky, where I currently live, one of the things that I did with the graduating seniors that year was, as they came off of the graduation line, there was a teacher line, and they could shake hands and hug and whatever they chose to do with their teachers that they've had over the years. And I told them, I said, if you want to make a guess and you want to ask me after you've graduated and as you're coming down the line, that was the one instance in which I decided to tell them confirm or disconfirm. And I don't know exactly, but it seemed, at least anecdotally, that most of them were wrong, which again I took as a good sign. And I think the idea that what scares me is the idea that we're teaching kids what to think and not how to think. And as we want to inoculate kids from any sort of dogma and dogmatic thinking, to me the way to do that is to teach inquiry and teach them those critical thinking skills, in which we're going to touch on for sure. But it struck me as I was sort of thinking more about this was the idea that we're teaching not what to think but how to think, but you have to think about something. And again, I think this is going to be a central part of our conversation. And I think it makes great sense to be able to give kids the what to think about, and have those things be particularly diverse in thought and heterodox, right? So that they are challenged and that they are maybe confirmed, and every classroom is going to have a diverse set of opinions and bias and that kind of thing. So yeah, I don't see that it's possible to not have some political bias, but again, how do we inoculate them? To me, it's the questioning skills. So go ahead.
I was going to say, the way I approach that in my classroom, every unit we have, I have a list of, I call them the controversial questions, and they're deliberately controversial questions and meant to elicit argument. Should parents be allowed to, or should parents hit their children? Why does this happen? Why does that happen? And I always tell my class that I am going to take the opposite view, no matter what people say. I'm going to take the opposite view of them. That it takes students a while to realize I'm not necessarily ascribing to what I'm arguing. And as a whole class conversation, usually it ends up being, two students versus everyone else. And I always take the two student side, and I always see some student has to explain to another student, like, oh no, Mr. Buck doesn't actually think this. He's just taking the opposite view from the majority of this class to make us think more. So I think, like you, I sometimes I do end up espousing my own view in the classroom, but that's only because it's a minority view.
Right. So to play the devil's advocate, which is kind of what you're talking about there, one of the questions that some folks might have about you and your viewpoints, and I guess your willingness to put them out there, is that, as best I can tell, and correct me if I'm wrong here, you've been teaching for 4 years, which is not an insignificant amount of time, but some folks long in the tooth say, yeah, he hasn't been around long enough to really understand it or know much of anything, and that kind of thing. So what do you say to those kinds of critics?
Usually I try and just engage them with the ideas that they're talking about. I think I naturally kind of fall into a learner relationship to the teachers that I interact with. So there are a couple other teachers at the school who are kind of the venerable teachers, the ones that everyone in the building knows are kind of the best teachers. And I'm usually asking them for recommendations for reading. I'm going to them and asking them for advice. The teachers who are not engaging me in constructive, positive conversation. Also, often don't have the best reputation, but I usually just try and pick out, okay, so what am I saying that's wrong? I'm willing to listen. I know that I don't have many gray hairs on my head. I have a few, but not a lot. And do you have a book that you would recommend? Is there an article? Is there something that I'm saying that you disagree with? And I really try and bring it back to the ideas, because I have my opinions, but I always like to say I hold them with loose hands. I hold my opinions. I'm going to say that I think I'm right, but I'm very, very willing to reconsider them, and I change them. If I look about what I think even 4 years ago when I started teaching, it is drastically different than the pedagogical, philosophical, educational views that I hold now. So
right.
Just try and get their opinion and let them know that I am listening. I'm not trying to tear down everything that they've been doing for the 30 years of their career.
Right. So as we, and lots of my work is in professional development of teachers, and I'm always, or very often, sort of stunned or at least mildly surprised at what is the understanding of pedagogy and teaching and learning and thinking about how that works and how things work well and how things don't work well. I'm often struck by the teachers who are fresh out of teacher pre-service or college or whatever you want to call it. And as you mentioned, in the 4 years, which is short but long, how that has changed for you. What did you, I guess in reflection, what was that process? Not that I want you to badmouth your teacher pre-service program. There's plenty of that going around and it's easy to do. But like, what would you say is I suppose the major pieces of growth or things that you notice looking back that you hadn't really engaged in that perhaps you could have or should have?
I'm going to start by complimenting my teacher pre-service program, because I don't do that enough. And I will say they did a very good job of giving me they showed me that students can. And every time I expressed any kind of doubt, the TA that I worked closest with called me out on it, and was like, they can, and it is on you to bring them to that point. It is your responsibility. You are the adult in the room. And I think because that was so ingrained deeply, that it's been what has pushed me to become a better teacher always and always and always, because I can't just say, oh, it's the students, all these kids these days, or I can't say, oh, the parents aren't engaging enough. They never show up for parent-teacher conferences. It's like, that might be the case, but it's still on me to, what are you going to do about that? Can't complain about administration unless I'm going to go talk to somebody and try and make the change that I want to. That's one of the more controversial opinions that I have, and the thing that gets me, not in arguments, but that I see ruffles the most feathers, is when I try and stop the conversations and say, hey, no, what can we do about this? Like, let's stop complaining about these other things. What can we as teachers do? Who do we need to email? What can we change to make this happen? But that isn't actually the question you asked. I just wanted to throw out a positive thing, because like you said, it is pretty easy to bash teacher education programs. My program, I think, I often describe it as 15 months of intensive political arguments. And I don't want to say there wasn't a lot of talk about actually the how to teach, but we spent most of our time talking about what should we teach, why are we teaching, what are the policies that we should have for public education. And I think I just went into the classroom and I just had no idea what I was supposed to say. Where am I supposed to stand? How do I work a copier? How should I arrange these desks? What do I do for the first 10 minutes of the class that I ever have? And it's just, we talked a lot about the ideas, but the nuts and bolts of teaching, I didn't really get. And what I did, which is right now where I'm spending a lot of my writing, is talking about a workshop model of English language arts. So giving students choice and teaching them the skills of reading, which again is sort of the touches on the article that instigated this conversation. But the nuts and bolts that I did get, the more I read, the more I teach, the more I see a aggressive skills-based, student choice, student-led form of education might not be the best for students.
Mm-hmm. So let's get to that article, and you've published articles in several different places, but the one that caught my attention was on Areo magazine, and the title of that is "Critical Thinking is Nothing Without Knowledge." And you somehow came across my Twitter feed, and the statement that got my attention was, I've always said, I'm quoting you, I've always said critical thinking was a nonsense concept. I finally did the reading and writing to defend my argument, which I am a big believer in critical thinking. So that naturally caught my eye, and I responded with, I don't remember exactly how I responded, but tell us, I guess.
Something like that. You said something, it was interesting, you don't entirely agree. This is where you agree, this is where you disagree. It was a very thoughtful and reasoned response.
Yeah, well, thank you. I try. Twitter is such a wonderful place to be thoughtful and reasonable, right? So give us the broad strokes on this article and your thinking, and what you mean by critical thinking is nothing without knowledge.
Mm-hmm. On the tweet that I actually sent, I think working behind the scenes for some of these publications, editing for some of these publications, there's always this, you have to walk the fine line between being thoughtful and reasoned and also getting some amount of traffic. Mm-hmm. And it's unfortunate that you need to toe that line, but if you just kind of, the editor for one of these publications that I write for, I won't say which one, but sent out an email to some of the common contributors and basically said, we're not getting as much traffic this year because rather than saying feminism is wrong, we're giving the thesis is 3 sentences long and it's really nuanced and nobody's going to click on that.
Right.
So we need to
be more sensationalistic.
Not be more sensationalistic, but include some amount of anecdote and be reasonable, but still, I guess what am I really trying to say is be more sensationalistic with euphemistic language.
Not necessarily.
So I'll just stop talking about that.
Not necessarily be sensationalistic, but be more sensationalistic.
So that tweet was, I think the critical thinking is a nonsense concept is this just ranty thought that I had basically since my teacher training program. And then I came to a more nuanced view as I did more reading into, got a few books on critical thinking and read a lot of articles on critical thinking. But where it really came from was, and I kind of talk about this in my piece, anytime I'm planning a unit or a new book that we're going to read or a new essay, I kind of sit down and I list all of the skills that I'm going to teach the students. And I sat down and tried to come up with, okay, if I were to teach a unit on critical thinking, what would I actually teach? And I couldn't really think of anything. And that's what got me to get these books. I got Teaching Critical Thinking by Bell Hooks. I got Cultural Literacy by E.D. Hirsch. I was reading Robert Pondicio's book, How the Other Half Learns, and didn't get it for that reason, but it ended up being incredibly related. And I came across this argument that I now seen that's been made many, many times, but this idea that critical thinking and literacy skills is basically synonymous with content knowledge. So knowledge is a skill, and skill, really, when you break it down, is just knowledge. So that's kind of what the crux argument of the piece is.
So let me make sure I'm understanding this correctly, the way that you said that. So to paraphrase, you're saying that critical thinking and content knowledge are at least somewhat synonymous?
E.D. Hirsch would go so far as to say yes. I am still toying around with this idea. For the time being, I'll say yeah, to take a stand, rather than kind of seesawing back and forth and not actually answering the question. Even the conversations I had after it, or the conversations that we've been having, our desire to get our students to think more deeply and not present a biased view to them. How do I get them to think deeply, critically about controversial topics? Is I give them a couple of articles that take different stands and they make their arguments well, and I expose the students to the data and the arguments that fall on either side of the immigration debate, or foreign affairs and war and all of these kinds of things. The critical thinking would be them just knowing about that.
Okay. So that I find that curious, because I don't see that those things being the same, and there's probably several ways in which I might define critical thinking, but just to sort of lean into the idea or the thinking behind Bloom's taxonomy, which is certainly not the only way to think about critical thinking, and there are certainly some people who are some criticisms of it, but it's a simple way for me and lots of teachers to think about the way that we relate with content and thinking. So I would put the basic two levels are remembering and understanding, which I describe as content knowledge and things we need to remember and understand and know. And then anything above that in that hierarchy, if you want to view it as the typical triangle, is critical thinking. So the idea that we're evaluating and analyzing and applying and creating, I would put those in the category of critical thinking, and then use the things that we would call content knowledge as the sort of the grist for the mill, the weight that you're lifting, whether it's math or science or social studies or whatever the content might be. So does that sound different from the way that you think about the relationship?
I think it's sometimes a tomato issue. I just brought up, I'm looking at Bloom's taxonomy, and you explained it very, very well. And like you said, there are a lot of people that like to criticize it. I'm very familiar with it. And I actually do, normally I've not been the biggest fan of Bloom's taxonomy, but just kind of looking at it right now, I'm trying to say, explain your side, paraphrase your side, using some more of my language. It's, what do we need to analyze and evaluate? Well, we need that understand and remember. If I'm asking my students to analyze Romeo and Juliet, or I have them ask lots of questions, I try and teach them to ask questions kind of using Bloom's taxonomy, asking comprehension questions, analysis questions, and connecting questions. They can't ask those questions unless they know about some of the issues that Romeo and Juliet deals with. They can't ask a question about Romeo and Juliet unless they've read the book. So is it a skill? Is it knowledge? Is it just one comes before the other? But when I ask my students often to analyze or evaluate, or I do a lot of support teaching, so I see a lot of other teachers teaching, and I'll see them give analyze the way that Harper Lee portrays Jim Crow and segregation in To Kill a Mockingbird. Well, if these students haven't done any reading with Jim Crow or To Kill a Mockingbird, how are they going to be able to analyze how Harper Lee portrays it? They don't know any other way that it's portrayed. They don't know what the laws are. They don't even know what the question's asking. So it's the idea that the students need to just know stuff in order to be able to analyze. They have to know stuff to be able to evaluate or even create.
Right. So I have this conversation several times. I've had it on Twitter and in some podcasts around this idea, and quite honestly, when I work with teachers and when we work with teachers, one of the things that we engage in with lots of teachers is what some folks would call progressive. I don't like that term because it's stigmatized and misapplied, misunderstood, and blah blah blah. It's sort of like liberal and Republican, Democrat and conservative and that kind of thing. So, but the idea of constructivist, inquiry-based, inquiry-led teaching, and one of the criticisms, and I think I've had some back and forth on Twitter with Robert, and you pronounced his name. I've never heard his name pronounced. Is it Pandiskio?
I have neither heard it pronounced Pandicio. Is how I've always said it. It might be completely different.
Yeah, and I don't know either. I just know the Twitter handle, and I have not yet read his book. I've heard it's good, and I would like to get a copy of that and read that. But I think I've jabbed back and forth with him and some other folks on this question about knowledge and its relationship to questions and things like that. So I would agree with you that we can't think about nothing, right? And I to finish my earlier thought that I got sidetracked on is that when I work with teachers, one of the criticisms about constructivist and inquiry-based learning is that it is light on understanding of knowledge and content. And those two things are not necessarily the same, but they're close enough to be probably synonymous for this conversation. And that we have a duty and in many ways an imperative as teachers to include knowledge and content in those conversations, but that I contend that we in many ways are doing it wrong, and we're doing it backwards. We're teaching backwards. And the power of using inquiry is that you can pull in deeper learning and that knowledge. The necessity of that deeper learning and knowledge becomes apparent to be able to answer the questions that you're trying to answer. And the way that I characterize that often is called pull teaching. So the pull dynamic versus push dynamic. And I think that is that when we talk about teachers, and if the underlying assumption is that they're using more push teaching, they're pushing information and knowledge and content at kids, at students, and expecting them, hoping that they will learn it. You might ask them to analyze something or whatever, but however you're doing that, you're pushing that at them and then testing it and hoping that they have retained it. That if you do that and you're not including significant knowledge, then I would agree that it's a problem. So shifting that, and I think flipping that to what we call pull teaching. So what we try to do is ask the questions that will pull that knowledge from students. And if we think about it again in the context of Bloom's taxonomy, instead of starting at the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy, and again using the triangle, the visual that people are probably most familiar with. So most teachers, I think, will start at the bottom, and the most mediocre teachers will stay at the bottom. They will just stay at the remember and understanding. They'll lecture and do didactic teaching and then test, right? So it's the most sort of drill and kill kind of teaching. And they never ask their students to analyze or evaluate or apply or create. And so if you take a next step up in sort of the sophistication or quality of teaching, as I think about it, at least in this context, is that you might start at the bottom, you would teach that stuff, you might call it front loading it, and then you might ask them to go to apply it or analyze it, right? So you would have them read the book, To Kill a Mockingbird, and then ask them to apply or analyze and make something, create something, or evaluate something. What we think about is starting at the top. So how can we create something, right? And if you take it to the end, that's what we call project-based learning. So I want you to design, develop, investigate, hypothesize something. And you start with a question that then gets them and forces them by design to identify, if you want to use a more visual term, uncover that content, those things they need to remember and understand in order to answer the question. So you're pulling that knowledge in ways that switches that dynamic, and then you're asking them through the project, if you're doing project-based learning, and that's the sort of the most sophisticated version of this, I think, is that you're asking them to analyze and evaluate and apply in the process of whatever that top verb is, which is synonymous with create. Again, develop, design, investigate, or something like that. So I don't know if that makes sense or if that's contrary to something that you're thinking about with teaching and learning.
I think, as I'm hearing you talk, our two theories of education, I think done well, often result in similar products. I start from the bottom and work my way to the top, and you start from the top and work your way to the bottom. But when I'm teaching, so one of the projects that I give for Romeo and Juliet is we end the whole unit with a fishbowl discussion, a Socratic seminar. They're all variations on the same thing. They're a little bit different, but some sort of group discussion. I do it a little bit differently every year, just depending on how my whims move me. But they argue about whether or not Romeo and Juliet is a love story. And I ask that question in the beginning, and then we read it. And along with that, we do a lot of other related readings that are going to actually give them something to talk about. Like you said, we have to think about something. King Lear, nothing comes from nothing. It's a good line from that play. But they have a whole unit of stuff to think about. I have them write an essay on this. And then finally, we have this, end of the unit discussion that lasts an hour and a half sometimes. And the students are banging on tables and getting really frustrated with each other. And it's absolutely just a joy of a time. And it's super fun to watch. And I roll up and, help push the conversation along and kind of push them to think a little more critically, where they're just kind of falling back and forth into the same talking points over and over and over. So I hear you talking, and we seem to come from different parts, but I wonder, how often is the product going to look the same? A second thought I had while you're talking, you keep bringing up Pondicio, but I read his book recently, so he's been on my mind. He had a good, I think this is where we're going to start to where we actually start to diverge, the project-based kind of student-led learning versus a very strict rote curriculum. He had this good piece recently at Fordham, the Fordham Institute, and he gave this really good analogy of curriculum and the 12 years of public education like an impressionist painting, where if every teacher is walking up and putting a bunch of different brush strokes on the painting, it's going to look like nothing. But if you have somebody planning the whole thing up close, each brush stroke doesn't look like much of anything. But once you step back, it all makes sense. And my worry with something like project-based learning is the student interest going to continue to drive them to the same place? Are they going to learn about, I don't want to use such a controversial topic, but it's just what came to my mind. Are they going to learn about climate change 15 times, but they have never actually learned what absolute zero is or what germ theory is? So I think that's where we're really going to start to diverge. The in the classroom teaching done well, good teaching is good teaching, but it's, well, what are we teaching? How are we planning and designing our teaching? How are we doing our curriculum? That's where we're going to start to disagree. And I just worry that with project-based student learning, there's just some stuff that kids should know, and it might be overlooked if it's not planned out in a very intentional, thoughtful, at times constraining and rote way.
Right. So actually, I think we're not going to diverge on that, and I would share the same concern. And when we talk with and work with schools and teachers, we emphasize, because I think that's I say it's a justified criticism of constructivist, project-based learning, inquiry-based learning, is that when we do that poorly or without the intentional architecture and design to pull the important knowledge and thinking out from students, then what we've done is just probably created something that is engaging and fun, or at least that's the aim, right? Mm-hmm. And while I definitely want school to be intellectually interesting and engaging and sometimes even fun, I as a side note, I would not say making school fun is a goal or an ideal that we should be constantly in pursuit of, because that's fool's gold. Yeah, you'll never be able to satisfy that consistently, and that doesn't mean I don't want it to be fun, because that certainly is a wonderful thing when we get there, but mm-hmm. that is not, I don't think, a good goal to be searching for or in mm-hmm. pursuit of. But the idea that it's interesting is certainly worthwhile. But again, unless we're in a genius hour or a passion projects kind of situation, we have a responsibility as teachers and as schools to deliver some set of knowledge that is important for life and to be prepared for life. And there's certainly some debate to be had over what that is, right? I mean, reading, writing, those kinds of things, math, basic math are obviously, I don't think anybody in their right mind doesn't want kids to be able to read and write at a decent level and do math at a decent level, right? Do they need to be able to mm-hmm. write high-level prose or do calculus? Well, certainly we get into some debates there, but I think the misunderstanding and rightful criticism of constructivist inquiry, project-based learning, is that often it's not done well. And in my brain, when it's not designed to pull the thing, that knowledge and content out by facilitation from kids, then we've got a problem. And mm-hmm. I don't know if you are familiar with Grant Wiggins. He passed away several years ago and was prolific in his writing, really thoughtful teacher. We have some of his pieces on TeachThought, but one of his quotes that I think is really genius. I'd be curious how you think about this and your reaction to this, but the quote that sometimes I share is that knowledge is an indicator of educational success, not the aim. And the idea that we're not including knowledge and that kids aren't coming away and shouldn't be coming away with significant knowledge that's a problem if that's what our teachers are doing. But I don't know, it's like, so we're called TeachThought, we're not teach content. And are we teaching content and hoping to get to thinking skills, or are we teaching thinking skills and using the content and knowledge in order to do that well? So I'll pause and mm-hmm. let you react to that.
I mean, my immediate response then is I'm not going to answer your question with a question. I'm going to answer your question with a question what are thinking skills? And that's, I had after my essay at Areo, where I was really advocating for teaching knowledge and teaching content and not so much these amorphous, hard to define skills. The conversations I kept having on Twitter where, while a skill is being able to determine a biased news source, well, some of mine and your ability to determine a biased news source is just, we know what the Atlantic is, we know what Washington Examiner is, we know what this or that is, and if we don't know, we Google it, and there are websites that can usually help you out. And even if we can't find out or we don't know, we read it and we know a little bit about all of the issues, and so we can see, like, oh, this person is really obviously wildly liberal or wildly Republican or conservative, and we can find that bias because we already kind of know what it is. Or what are other thinking skills that somebody might say? The ability to ask questions, I've kind of already touched on. If somebody doesn't know anything about the U.S. relations with Iran, how could they ask a good question about a decision to kill one of the generals? If they don't know the history there, if they don't know the current politics, if they don't know general theories of, like, I think there's Krautheimer has this great essay on different world structures, and one of them is there's something to be said about having a central world hegemon that's kind of the world's police. It's not ideal. It's just one among many structures. But, like, if you don't know these arguments and theories, then how can you even ask a question beyond, what's Iran? Like, wait, who's this person? So a lot of those thinking skills, I think, again, it comes back to Bloom's taxonomy. How can we ask those good questions? How can we determine bias? How can we any of the rest of those? How can we do those if we don't have the knowledge to do it?
Right. Well, I would say that, again, I think we're overlapping here because you're hitting on the central theme for the way that I think about teaching and learning, which is inquiry, right? So when we talk about preparing kids for the modern world, there's certainly some basic content that is necessary, and then you can debate some of the specifics as we get more specialized and older and that kind of thing. But my contention is that perhaps the most important skill that we can instill in our kids and our students as they become adults is that ability to ask questions. I just published actually yesterday or this morning why inquiry, why critical thinking is so a blog piece about critical thinking and inquiry, and the example that I often use is the 2008 housing crisis, in which people signed all kinds of documents that bought them a house, or actually didn't buy them a house, but gave them the keys to a house, but that they couldn't afford, and that they did not have the skill of being able to ask the questions that are really important that they should have asked. Like, what happens if I can't pay my bills? What happens? Will my rate change? And why am I paying $1,000 in closing costs? And what is a closing cost? And all of those things, right? So, the more knowledge you have, and I think this is an important point, and perhaps something that the most simplistic inquiry constructivist teachers, maybe to use a different word, the least skilled inquiry constructivist teachers would say would overlook, that the sense of knowledge is really important, and I would say the opposite. But so to your point, you ask better questions when you know more, but it is that process of uncovering and asking those questions that is, number one, a really important skill. But as we think about teaching and learning, and again, getting at push teaching, where we're solely saying, this is important stuff for you to know, I've identified this is important for you to know, and that's why I'm teaching it to you. We lose the opportunity cost of doing it that way. From the way that I see it, is that you lose the ability to effectively teach them the inquiry skills of saying, here's a question or a challenge, and I want you to identify what it is that's important to need to know. And a great teacher, using that approach, guides and facilitates to make sure, and has designed the question, and has the facilitation skills to be able to pull those important knowledge pieces out. And those who don't, if we're not designing it well, and then they're the part of facilitating it well, then we're misaligned, as I would say, in our teaching. So now I would recognize that that's hard, and unfortunately, when we get back to teacher prep and pre-service, I don't think that lots of teacher pre-service programs are instilling that teaching skill in their pre-service, and I don't think it's a mindset of lots of people. So I do recognize that it's perhaps somewhat rare and difficult to do, and so maybe it's easier to just lean back into the easier way which is to say, this is important, you need to know it, I'm going to teach it, and you need to, buckle down and learn it, that kind of thing.
As you're talking, there's some verbiage that I really like that I came across recently, and this might just be replacing one buzzword with another buzzword. So call me out on that if it is. But a phraseology that I really liked recently was teaching the habits of critical thinking versus critical thinking skills. Because when I think of a skill, I think of something that you can sit down, you learn it, you can practice it, you can do a rote drill, and you've learned it. And that's, I think, where I'm still hung up on the idea that critical thinking is a skill. Critical thinking is important, but I don't think I'd be willing to say that it's a skill. But there are habits of critical thinkers. What are the things that critical thinkers do? They, when they have a question, they don't just kind of like think, oh, I don't know it. They go out and seek out writing for it. They ask other people. They try and write their own opinions about it. They engage in conversation with people they agree with and people that they disagree with. And these are the habits of a critical thinker. Engaging in conversations with people that you disagree with, that's not a skill. I mean, there are people who do it poorly and fall back on ad hominem attacks. So maybe rhetorical strategies is a skill. Giving them, in the ESL world, we call them conversational moves, giving them a sentence starter to use. I agree with because, I disagree with because, I want to add on to what so-and-so said. Giving them these moves, and that'll help them. But these are the habits of a critical thinker. And that might kind of be somewhere where you and I can, I think we've agreed more than we seem to agree through this conversation, but that's something that we can both really say, that they're habits.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to phrase it, and I use that sometimes, and might even add to that a mindset. Skills is perhaps overused, and it's sort of like you say the word enough times, it sort of starts to lose all meaning. But I tend to use mindset in lots of settings because it is just about how we do things, right? Which I suppose is how habits might be viewed, right? So when I talk with and interact with my daughters who are 11 and 12, I certainly am trying to develop those habits or that mindset, and whether we can call it skills or whatever, right? The idea that we are constantly curious, and that it's a mindset of, and I think this is an important mindset. The way to describe this is that we're not trying to figure out how we're right so much as we're trying to figure out how we're wrong. And that is a mindset, right? So it's not about trying, and we see this on social media, we see this with our media, major media, and the polarization and the tribes and all of that, right? So we're trying to confirm what we want to be true, a desirability bias and or confirmation bias, and there's a difference in those two things, but that's a real problem. And so how I want to be wrong as short a time as possible, and I want to figure out how I am wrong as quickly as possible so that I can correct that. And the unfortunately there's a lack of social currency for that mindset right now, and I think that's a big problem in our culture and our society, and also I think is not something that we're teaching particularly well in our schools. And I think part of that is teaching practice, which has been affected by accountability and testing, which is, again, sort of that push teaching model of this is the important stuff, sit down and learn it. And that doesn't have to be that way. Certainly, there are rich teaching and learning experiences that happen with some really engaging teachers who are, sort of pushing information and knowledge at students. But the reductive nature of teaching and people, just in general, is that it often gets boiled down to really poor practice. So I think that habits works just fine, and again, how we get that as a habit or a mindset or a skill, using the knowledge as opposed to teaching the knowledge and hoping to get those habits developed, I think is probably where we're maybe disagreeing or have differences in this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the more fundamental beliefs I have about education is the question isn't so much what is the best way to teach, but what is sort of the end goal of your product. And somebody could do, I think, a project-based learning very, very well. And it's going to make a very critically, a student who thinks critically, who knows a lot, who is ready for this world. And somebody who goes through a very teacher-centered, sort of the high-stakes charter school is the stereotypical epitome. They go through that, and they're going to come through a critically thinking, knowledgeable student for this world. But the way they think and the things they know are going to be very different in those two instances. If they go to a Christian or a Montessori private school, or if they go to a public school, it's going to produce a very different student. But I think they're all desirable products in the end. And I think part of the problem is I see a lot of curriculum, even at my own school, that tries to do a bit of the teacher-centered and a bit of the project-based learning together, and then doesn't do either to fidelity, and you're left with a poor product. You know, you're left with failing scores. You're left with teachers who don't know what they're doing, who don't really believe in what they're doing, so they don't do it well. You're left with students who are run amok. You're left with final projects that a student could miss the whole semester and still somehow get an A on this final project because it's not well thought out, it's not well designed, and what I don't want to see everyone teaching like me, but I do want a diversity of teaching styles, but done well. So maybe not all at the same school. You know, I like the idea. This would be get us into a whole nother long conversation on policy, but school choice, where you might in one district have one school that's known for project-based learning and one school that's known for teacher-centered direct instruction, and the teachers who agree with both of those can choose to go to those schools. So I'm just because of the books that I've read and where I fall more into the direct instruction and teacher-centered learning, and you would teach at the project-based learning school, but we're both doing it well, versus having an administration breathing down our necks telling us to do something that we don't entirely agree with, and a bit of both, and no one quite knows what they're talking about. So yeah, I think it comes back to, you said, just the practice and doing it well.
Yeah, well, there's certainly lots to be desired in the practice and doing things well, and there's multiple reasons for that. I wrote a blog piece that's basically talking about why teaching is really a hard. Being a great teacher is really hard, and there's a number of reasons, and we should be working to try to make it as easy as possible to be a great teacher. Not easy to be a teacher necessarily, but as easy as possible to be a great teacher, because it would benefit everybody, including of course the students, but culture, society, and every stakeholder, which is everybody in the country and around the world. So I do want to make sure that I'm not misunderstood in that when I'm talking about this sort of pool teaching and constructivist inquiry-led, that we're not going to have direct instruction or teacher-led moments, because I do think that's a misconception or a mischaracterization and misunderstanding on the part of people who might criticize constructivist learning. You say I joke about it. It's not free range chicken, right? We shouldn't be saying, here's a project, I'll see you in 3 weeks, and I'm going to cross my fingers you learn something, but have fun. That is a train wreck. And what we want to think about is, how do we, again, pull that content knowledge as questions, get it up on a list of here's what we need to know and learn. And then my job as a teacher is to help you understand it. And some of that process might entail me as a teacher, direct teaching. I mean, didactic. It could be a lecture. Obviously, we would want to include formative assessments in that process, not just a monologue. And those kinds of things still happen in great constructivist learning. And I don't want people to come away with the impression that it's an either or. And I guess one of the, I know we're probably coming towards the end of our time together, but when you talk about, or you mentioned something about, that there are these two different approaches, and of course doing them well either way, I think is important. I would agree with you there, but that they produce, that they both produce, I guess, good products in the students, right? That they come out as whatever it is that we want them to come out as. And so I guess I'm not sure that I agree, and I've probably done at least some justice to what I think the constructivist student might end up as, and I'm wondering what you think the non-constructivist teaching student might bring to the table as an adult that they wouldn't get as a constructivist in a constructivist setting.
So to talk about something concrete in this, I think about an example that I used in the piece that I wrote, and I kind of already brought up in this conversation, would be Trump's policies in the Middle East. A constructivist, a student who's been educated on the constructivist model would immediately be able to see the questions they need to ask, what they need to go do, what they need to read, pick out what they don't know, and begin this search to know more. And I think somebody a student in a non-constructivist approach would come and be able to make the connections to historical anecdotes that they already know. They might be able to pull in, I don't know if King Lear actually relates, but, oh, hey, I read King Lear and it makes me think of this quote from it. They know the science behind some of the I don't know, I guess atomic bombs probably wouldn't be learned, but they have this knowledge that they can pull from and they can make allusions to, versus I feel like I've made my point. not sorry, that came across more aggressive. I'm just thinking, is there more than I need to say, or am I done talking?
Right. Well, so I guess in response to that, I think there may be some more of those examples that they might be able to pull from, but not necessarily. Again, if we're doing constructivist teaching in the way that I think about it, is we're asking those questions, but then we're also taking those questions and using those questions to learn about King Lear or atomic bombs or whatever, right? So that constructivist, that student who engaged with the same kinds of questions and content on that topic, ostensibly would come away with the same, or at least pretty similar, sense of content knowledge and understanding, but it's just that learning is connected to their thinking or their questions that they, with the help of the facilitator, the teacher, help them surface, right? So when I think about, let's use maybe this example, resonates a little bit more easily. When I talk about teaching of history, and I think U.S. history is a great example, I think we've taught it in such a strange way. And a more teacher-centered version of that is, here's all the history that you need to know. and there's this long list. It's linear. Some people talk about teach it in themes or whatever, right? It could be taught in a number of different ways sequentially, but it's still, this is what I as a teacher and the textbooks and the curriculum says is important for you to know, and I'm going to teach it, and I'm going to ask you to do some analysis and things with it in the process, which is good. In a constructivist setting, I think about history of so why do we teach history? So we teach history, the common response is, of course, so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past, which we have failed miserably at. And so the reason, or a big reason in my mind, why we teach history and we learn history is so that we can be better informed citizens, make decisions based on some understanding of what has happened before and the factors that led into it and what happened when that happened, and all of that kind of thing, right? So it strikes me as odd that we don't teach history in the context of how can we be better informed citizens or better citizens and informed democracies and things like that. And to be able to do that, to be able to be an informed citizen, you need to know the major events in history and ask the questions that are really important. And I would say it's an interesting question to think about, is that instead of saying, here's all the knowledge, if a successful student in a history class, is it more important for them to know all of the things in the history class, or is it more important for them to know the important questions that we should be asking in that history class? And you can't know those important questions without having rich knowledge and understanding. So I don't know if that gives any clarity.
Yeah, and you're hitting on, I think, one of the fundamental, the deeper questions that, there was the canon wars were named after it. Is there certain things that every American should know or not? Is it better to read Tolstoy than Patricia McCormick, a young adult author? Are there certain events that students absolutely need to know? And you were saying, I'm trying to remember exactly how you phrased your question at the end. Is it better that the students know the stuff we taught in history, or I don't remember what the other half of that dichotomy was that you asked.
Should they have, the simplest version is, is it more important for them to know all of the answers, or is it more important for them to know the most important questions?
And I would say the answers. I don't think any student, there are certain things that when push comes to shove, a student needs to know that slavery happened. A student needs to know that Jim Crow happened. A student needs to know that World War II and the Civil War happened. And I think the best way to guarantee that those absolutely fundamental pieces of knowledge are taught is not through a constructivist approach.
So if they knew, to be able to, again, to reiterate, and I don't want to belabor this, is that from the way that I think about this, is to be able to know the most important questions that we should be asking. One would have to know all of those things that you listed. So not only do they know those things that you listed, but they also know the questions and have developed that questioning skill. And at least as I'm understanding it, having that knowledge doesn't necessarily mean they would know the important questions, nor would they have that questioning skill. Essentially, they and not to again be totally reductivist, but essentially it's an encyclopedia, right?
And I think this comes back to practice then, and we're now just going back to the same points over and over and over, where a student taught with the constructivist teacher who knows what they're doing and is doing it well is going to have all of this knowledge and the questions. And I think a non-constructivist teacher who isn't doing their job well, the students won't have the questions, but they'll at least have some of the content. I this was a response to a comment you made a few comments ago, but in my teaching, this isn't a dichotomy, like you said.
Right.
I do a bit of both. Some of my, I fundamentally come back to this teacher-centered approach, but I know that constructivist practices and theories are incredibly engaging. So in every part of my unit, or in every unit that I have, I make sure to incorporate some of this inquiry, because that's what's going to make them find To Kill a Mockingbird or Romeo and Juliet or the Odyssey or whatever we happen to be reading at the time. That inquiry is what's going to make it interesting and meaningful to them. So like you said, it's never a perfect dichotomy. A constructivist has direct instruction, and a non-constructivist educator is going to incorporate elements of inquiry into their instruction. At least I hope they do.
Right. Yeah. And I appreciate that. And I think it's important that we can't have this conversation, pseudo argument, without sort of forcing a dichotomy. But in fact, there is no real dichotomy, right?
Yeah.
I'm mindful of time here, and I do want to wrap up, but I wonder, are you familiar with Michael Polanyi, who back in the 60s and had done quite a bit of writing, and I did a podcast, and we had as a guest speaker a professor at Morehead State University, and this is one of the things that where it came from. It was a really interesting conversation when I think he mentioned the idea of knowing the important questions to be asking at the end of a course as opposed to the knowledge. And he's actually a little bit more, I would say less constructivist in his teaching, or maybe more in line with that conversation that you wrote about in the Areo magazine article, but the idea of tacit knowledge, which is different from sort of surface knowledge, and that's one of those things that we see in schools way too much, I think, is learning something and gaining knowledge for the purpose of something you're going to use it on very quickly, which is usually a test, versus tacit knowledge being something, that knowledge that you can use in a number of different ways, and there's that transferability. So I would urge listeners to investigate Polanyi's work and writing, and I'll link to the podcast that I mentioned in the show notes. But I don't know if you've done any work or thinking in that tacit knowledge kind of realm.
I can't say I can speak directly to Polanyi or tacit knowledge, but it does make me think of E.D. Hirsch, which is sort of the scholar and thinker where I pull most of my ideas, and we're sort of, I guess it's my camp. I'm doing the quote fingers right now, my tribe.
Your tribe.
Yeah. Again, doing the quote fingers as we're talking, because I know it's a horrible phraseology. But a lot of it really comes back to his thought. He talks about how people living in society don't need to know every single detail about the Civil War or the life of Ulysses S. Grant, but to understand, if they're going to pick up the New York Times and understand the 1619 Project, they need to at least know some basics about the Civil War. They need to know what happened and what it means. And they don't need to know the detailed minutia of the politics of chattel slavery, but they need to know how brutal it was, and they need to know that it happened and who was culpable in it. And you need to know a little bit about a lot. And I think that's the difference between testing knowledge, which is you're learning all of this specifics, the date that you're never going to remember, but never ever asking, well, why is this important? And what does it mean for me? And what does it mean for the contemporary world? Which is then tying into more an inquiry, question asking. And this is where we start to agree.
Yeah.
What's the point of learning those things if you can't connect it to bigger, deeper questions?
Right. Well, Dan, it's been a pleasure. Appreciate your willingness to stand in the line of fire or whatever you want to, however you want to characterize that. But certainly an important conversation. And I think both of us would agree that, when you come back to the central issue of practice, that can improve on all fronts. And definitely we need to be working on that. So I want to give you an opportunity to share any links and resources or projects that you're working on so that folks can find you and yell at you on Twitter or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, you can find me. I write for Arc Digital, Areo, and Quillet are the three that I write for most and that I like the most. There are a few other places that I write for just to challenge myself to write something a little bit differently. But those are the three places that you can find me. I'm on Twitter at DanTitheses396. And I guess you can find me in Green Bay, Wisconsin, but I hope no one ever drives up here and tries to find me because something tells me they're not looking for a friendly conversation if that's the case.
Right. Okay. Well, again, I appreciate the conversation, and we'll try to put at least some of those links in the show notes. If folks are listening on Twitter, or on iTunes or something like that, you'll have to go to wegroteachers.com or teachthought.com and find the this episode, and click there. But I appreciate the conversation, and thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I feel like I learned something today.
Yeah, well, thank you. Me too. That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, teachthought.com and wegrowteachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.